In the autumn of 1888, the city of Minneapolis followed the regular rhythm of a growing community in the upper Midwest of America. The streets were crisscrossed by horse-drawn streetcars, local commerce reflected the region's agricultural prosperity, and the warehouses near the Mississippi River operated with the discipline typical of a center consolidating itself as an economic hub of the state of Minnesota. The weather, already cold in the first weeks of October, altered daily habits. Heavier coats appeared on the sidewalks. Social gatherings moved indoors, and the pace of conversations adjusted to the comfort of rooms heated by wood-burning stoves. Among merchants, teachers, and workers in the flour milling industry, the routine did not indicate that this city would host an event that would permanently mark the history of the Adventist denomination in the United States. The General Conference of Seventh-day Adventists had convened its annual assembly in Minneapolis that October. Since its formal organization in 1863, during the turbulent years of the American Civil War, Adventist leadership had met periodically to address administrative issues, missionary expansion, and doctrinal standardization. By 1888, the church had expanded beyond its original northeastern core, reaching the Midwest, the West Coast, and beginning a presence in foreign territories. With institutional growth came challenges related to theological standardization and ministerial training. Delegates began arriving days before the official opening of the sessions. Many traveled long distances by train, crossing rural landscapes already marked by the end of the harvest. Pastors, editors, and administrators brought with them field reports, regional concerns, and carefully organized manuscripts. Among them were names already known in the denominational scene, such as George I Butler, then president of the General Conference, although his failing health prevented him from attending all meetings in person, and Uriah Smith, influential editor of the Review and Herald, whose pen had shaped the prophetic understanding of many members for decades. The atmosphere preceding the formal meetings was not one of open tension, but of cautious expectation. Since the mid-1870s, internal debates had intensified regarding specific interpretations of the law in Galatians and its relationship to justification by faith. The prevailing exegetical tradition held that the law mentioned by the Apostle Paul referred primarily to the ceremonial law. This position was associated with the defense of the Sabbath as a permanent moral commandment, a central element of Adventist identity. However, two young editors from the West Coast, Alonzo T. Jones and Elliot J. Waggoner, had been presenting an alternative reading in publications and ministerial meetings, suggesting that the Pauline text could also include the moral law in its pedagogical argument. Even before the sessions officially began, parallel meetings took place in local inns and residences. Delegates exchanged views, cited recent articles, and assessed the potential impact of the new theological emphases. For many experienced leaders, the concern was not only with the doctrinal content, but also with the possibility of institutional fragmentation. The memory of past dissensions, common to various religious movements of the 19th century, was still present as a silent warning. When the sessions began at the designated assembly venue, the atmosphere reflected the formality typical of denominational gatherings of the period. Benches arranged in rows, a raised platform for speakers, and gas lighting composed the setting. Administrative reports occupied the first few hours, addressing growth statistics, finances, and the progress of publications. The tone was methodical, almost bureaucratic, as befitted an organization seeking to consolidate its structure amidst geographic expansion. However, as the days went by, theological discussions gained prominence. Jones presented historical and biblical studies with a detailed emphasis on prophetic documents and chronologies. Waggoner focused on expositions of the letter to the Galatians and the concept of righteousness by faith. Their speeches were not fiery. They were structured, dense, and supported by textual references. Even so, they provoked distinct reactions among the listeners. Some recorded in personal letters that they perceived a renewed emphasis on the centrality of faith in Christ, while others feared that the new approach would relativize already established pillars. Among those present was Ellen G. White, whose trajectory had followed the movement since its Millerite origins. In her later accounts, she described the meeting as a moment of intense discussion, emphasizing the need for a conciliatory spirit. Her manuscripts from that period reveal a concern with personal attitudes rather than technical formulations, observing that theological debates could easily take on the contours of human rivalry. In the hallways and during breaks between sessions, conversations continued in a restrained tone. The religious culture of the late 19th century valued the vigorous defense of convictions, but also maintained rigid codes of formal respect. Even so, epistolary accounts indicate that feelings of resistance and distrust circulated discreetly. A meeting which had begun within the usual administrative routine gradually took on a greater weight than many had anticipated. As October progressed and the cold intensified outside, internal discussions also deepened, preparing the ground for decisive moments that would mark the following days of the assembly. As the sessions progressed into the second week of October 1888, the pace of presentations gave way to more direct debates. What initially manifested as interpretative divergence began to occupy the center of the formal meetings. The reading of the epistle to the Galatians became the axis around which arguments, biblical quotations, and historical references gravitated. It was not merely a technical difference regarding Pauline terminology, but a discussion that touched upon the theological identity constructed over decades. Elliot J. Waggoner dedicated several presentations to the theme of justification by faith, structuring his arguments from the biblical text and a historical reading of the Protestant Reformation. He cited passages methodically, connecting them to the 19th century Christian experience without resorting to exalted rhetoric. His emphasis was on the sufficiency of Christ's work and on the human inability to achieve righteousness through one's own merit. Some delegates saw this approach as a reaffirmation of classical Protestantism. Others perceived the risk of shifting the distinctive focus of Adventism. Alonzo T. Jones, in turn, added a historical dimension to the debates. Known for his interest in history and chronology, he contextualized the discussions within previous theological conflicts of Christianity. In his interventions, he sought to demonstrate that the relationship between law and grace had been a recurring theme throughout the centuries. His direct way of arguing, combined with intellectual certainty, aroused admiration in some and resistance in others. Among the more cautious opponents were experienced leaders who had defended the traditional interpretation for years. Uriah Smith represented this generation. As editor of the denominational's main publication, he had exerted significant influence on the doctrinal formation of the church. For him and other colleagues, the interpretation that the law in Galatians referred primarily to ceremonial law offered protection against external criticism and preserved the emphasis on the Sabbath as a moral commandment. Altering this reading seemed, in their view, to open the door to confusion among members and pastors. The absent president, George I. Butler, sent letters expressing concern about the direction of the discussions. His frail health kept him physically away, but his words circulated among the delegates. He warned against hasty changes and reinforced the importance of doctrinal unity. These letters were read at administrative meetings, contributing to an atmosphere of caution. The atmosphere inside the auditorium grew progressively denser. Later observers noted that facial expressions revealed contained tension. The Protestant culture of the period valued public debate as a legitimate means of seeking truth, but the institutional context made each argument potentially decisive for organizational cohesion. Some delegates carefully noted each point presented, preparing detailed responses for subsequent sessions. Ellen G. White took a unique position in that setting. In interventions recorded in her manuscripts and letters, she did not present systematic treatises on the law in Galatians during the assembly, but repeatedly emphasized the need for a humble spirit and openness to study. Her comments suggested concern about defensive attitudes that could obscure biblical understanding. At the same time, she avoided publicly aligning herself with simplistic factions, even though she demonstrated sympathy for the Christocentric emphasis presented by Jones and Waggoner. Outside of the main sessions, smaller meetings became spaces for more frank discussion. Pastors met in small groups in hostels, re-evaluating positions they had held for years. Adventist expansion into new regions demanded solid theological training, and many leaders feared that public disagreements would compromise the trust of the members. The debate went beyond the exegetical field and reached the psychological terrain of leadership. The records indicate that there were periods of prolonged silence following certain presentations, followed by careful responses. There is no evidence of widespread disorder or formal breakdown during the assembly, but the intellectual intensity was evident. Each argument was analyzed not only for its biblical merit, but also for its institutional implications. As the days went by, it became clear that the meeting in Minneapolis would not produce a simple resolution. There was no definitive vote to end the debate. Instead, the perception solidified that the discussion inaugurated a broader period of theological reflection within the denomination. The assembly was nearing its formal conclusion, but the issues raised there would continue to resonate in Adventist publications, schools, and pulpits in the months that followed. As the formal sessions of the assembly drew to a close in late October 1888, the cold in Minneapolis was becoming more severe. Delegates began packing their bags and documents, preparing for the long journeys back to their home regions. The atmosphere in the auditorium had become less combative in recent days, not because the disagreements had been fully resolved, but because it had become clear that the debate would not reach a definitive conclusion in that space. The administrative closure followed the usual protocol. Final reports were presented, recommendations voted on, and missionary commitments reaffirmed. The organizational structure of the General Conference of Seventh-day Adventists remained intact, without formal splits or institutional ruptures. Still, many who left Minneapolis carried the impression that they had participated in a turning point. In the months that followed, the effects of the assembly became more visible outside the walls of the auditorium. Denominational publications began to reflect, with greater or lesser intensity, the themes discussed. Sermons and ministerial institutes revisited the issue of justification by faith, now with renewed emphasis. Alonzo T. Jones and Elliot J. Waggoner were invited to present studies in different regions, broadening the reach of their ideas. At the same time, resistance persisted. Private letters reveal that some leaders considered the conduct of the debate to be hasty or inadequate. The concern was not only theological but also generational. Many of the Adventist pioneers had built their doctrinal understanding in a context of confrontation with other Protestant denominations, defending the Sabbath and the prophecies of Daniel and Revelation as distinctive marks. The new emphasis seemed to temporarily shift the focus of discussions to broader themes of historical Protestantism. Ellen G. White left Minneapolis shortly after the sessions concluded, but continued to write extensively about what she had witnessed. In letters to leaders and members, she described the meeting as a time of resistance to further light and warned against attitudes of intellectual pride. Her manuscripts do not offer a detailed technical report of the arguments presented, but they record the emotional and spiritual atmosphere she perceived. She insisted on the need for continuous study and personal humility, maintaining focus on practical Christian experience. In 1889 and 1890, Jones and Waggoner participated in Bible institutes and camp meetings where they more fully developed their expositions. In some places, they were received with genuine interest. In others, they encountered reservations. The circulation of their printed sermons broadened the debate beyond the circle of delegates present in Minneapolis. The episode began to be reinterpreted as it spread to different mission fields. The 1890s also brought significant institutional changes to the denomination. Educational and medical expansion progressed, new local conferences were organized, and international work intensified. In this broader context, the discussion initiated in 1888 became part of a process of theological maturation. The emphasis on righteousness by faith was progressively incorporated into official language, although not all exegetical details were uniformly adopted. Some of the protagonists of that meeting would face complex trajectories in the following years. Jones, for example, would become involved in later administrative controversies. Waggoner would also experience institutional tensions in later phases of his life. These developments show that the impact of Minneapolis was not limited to a single event, but was intertwined with personal decisions and structural changes in the church. For many Adventist historians, the 1888 assembly represents a point of internal reassessment, rather than a formal rupture. Documents preserved in denominational archives reveal a gradual process of theological adjustment, influenced by public debates and private reflections. The meeting did not immediately redefine all positions, but it altered the tone of subsequent discussions. By the end of that decade, the vocabulary of faith and grace already occupied a more consistent space in official publications. What began as an exegetical disagreement in a Minneapolis auditorium went on to shape denominational discourse for years. And while the protagonists went their separate ways, the memory of the 1888 meeting continued to be reinterpreted in light of subsequent events, preparing the ground for broader historical assessments in later generations. In the years following the 1888 assembly, the routine of local churches continued with relative stability. On Saturdays, members gathered in small wooden churches scattered throughout agricultural towns in the Midwest, villages in New England, and emerging communities on the West Coast. Itinerant pastors traveled long distances by train or carriage, carrying reports, periodicals, and new administrative instructions. Denominational life maintained its regular rhythm of camp meetings, Sabbath schools, and missionary projects. Yet beneath this appearance of normalcy, the memory of Minneapolis remained active behind the scenes. During the 1890s, the leadership of the General Conference of Seventh-day Adventists faced administrative challenges that required structural reorganization. International growth, especially in Australia and Europe, increased the demands for coordination. At the same time, theological debates did not disappear. They were absorbed into new contexts. The emphasis on justification by faith, prominently featured in 1888, gradually became integrated into editorial articles, Bible lessons, and ministerial manuals, although not always with explicit reference to the Minneapolis meeting. Ellen G. White, who moved to Australia in 1891, continued to write on themes related to faith, obedience, and Christian character. Her books published in subsequent years reflected language that many associated with the discussions initiated in 1888. Historians note that, although she did not systematize a formal treatise on the Minneapolis controversy, her later literary output consolidated the centrality of grace in the Adventist religious experience. At the same time, her writings also maintained the importance of the moral law, avoiding the dichotomy that some feared. Alonzo T. Jones assumed editorial and administrative roles in later years, becoming an even more visible public figure. His direct style and firm conviction continued to generate both admiration and discomfort. Elliot J. Waggoner also remained active in preaching and writing, although his personal and institutional trajectory later included distancing events that influenced the historical perception of his role in 1888. These individual developments, occurring years later, have often been retroactively associated with the Minneapolis meeting, even though the facts are more complex than a simple cause and effect relationship. At the beginning of the 20th century, the denomination underwent a significant reorganization in 1901, expanding administrative decentralization. This process occurred within a broader context of institutional growth and reflection. Some veteran participants from 1888 were still alive and retrospectively interpreted that meeting as a moment of caution regarding human attitudes within theological debates. Others saw it as a necessary step in doctrinal maturation. Over the decades, especially from the mid-20th century onward, Adventist historians began to re-examine original documents, letters, and manuscripts preserved in archives. The Minneapolis Assembly came to be described in books and articles as a decisive event in the Adventist understanding of justification by faith. However, the temporal distance allowed for a more balanced reading of the events. Academic studies indicate that the debate was not limited to two clearly defined sides, but involved multiple concerns: preservation of identity, fear of fragmentation, and the search for biblical coherence. The 1888 General Conference, viewed from the 21st century, reveals itself less as an isolated dramatic confrontation and more as a reflection of a religious movement in the process of consolidation. Geographic expansion, the need for more systematic theological training, and interaction with the broader American Protestantism created a favorable environment for internal revisions. The meeting in Minneapolis occurred at a time when the church was ceasing to be a small group of pioneers and becoming a structured institution, with schools, publishing houses, and an international presence. In the preserved archives, official minutes maintain a moderate language, while personal letters record more intense impressions. This documentary duality offers the historian a human portrait. Leaders attempting to balance theological convictions, institutional responsibility and personal relationships. The Code of October 1888, the gaslight-lit meetings, and the carefully argued debates compose a scenario that continues to be studied more than a century later. Thus, the General Conference held in Minneapolis is not merely a dated event, but a chapter that influenced the evolution of Adventist discourse throughout subsequent generations, integrating itself into the larger historical process of religious identity formation in the American context of the late 19th century. Looking back at the General Conference held in Minneapolis in 1888 from over a century later, what emerges is not an isolated episode of theological conflict, but a true portrait of a religious community in the process of consolidation. The General Conference of Seventh-day Adventists was in a phase of transition. It was leaving behind the pioneering generation marked by organizational improvisation and gradually assuming the form of a structured institution with an international presence, a developing educational system, and growing editorial responsibility. The Minneapolis meeting took place within this concrete reality. It was not convened to resolve a single crisis, but to fulfill the regular agenda of reports, appointments, and missionary planning. However, discussions about the interpretation of the law in Galatians and the emphasis on justification by faith revealed tensions that had accumulated over the years. These tensions were not merely exegetical. They involved concerns about denominational identity, the preservation of distinctive doctrines, and fears about the influence of broader Protestant currents. Historical records show that there was no formal rupture at the end of the sessions. No immediate schism occurred, no doctrinal redefinition was voted on abruptly. The administrative structure remained intact. However, the debate altered the vocabulary and focus of subsequent reflections. Language about faith, grace, and dependence on Christ began to occupy a more consistent space in publications and ministerial training. The process was gradual, sometimes silent, incorporated into the daily life of local churches and the pages of denominational periodicals. Letters preserved in archives reveal that many participants left Minneapolis aware that they had witnessed something significant, even if not entirely defined. Some recorded concern. Others expressed relief or renewed interest in Bible study. Over the years, the assembly became a point of reference for later debates on spirituality and doctrine within American Adventism. It is also necessary to recognize the human dimension of the episode. Experienced leaders defended positions they had held for decades, while younger voices presented alternative interpretations with conviction and confidence. The reactions involved temperaments, personal trajectories, and institutional responsibilities. The story preserves both theological arguments and emotional impressions. This combination helps to understand Minneapolis not as a simplified confrontation between right and wrong, but as a moment of internal negotiation within a growing organization. In the following decades, the denomination underwent administrative reorganizations and significant missionary expansion. The memory of 1888 was reinterpreted as new generations analyzed documents and reevaluated past decisions. The episode took on symbolic dimensions in later historical narratives, sometimes amplified, sometimes simplified. However, returning to primary sources, it becomes clear that the encounter reflected the normal complexities of a religious movement seeking doctrinal coherence, while facing rapid geographical expansion. The city of Minneapolis returned to its routine after the delegates left. The streets remained busy, the warehouses maintained their pace of work, and winter arrived as in so many other years. For most local residents, that assembly was just another religious event held in their public buildings. For Adventists, however, it became a landmark of internal reflection that would influence speeches, books, and administrative decisions over time. Thus, the 1888 General Conference remains a historical record of institutional maturation and theological revision within 19th century American Adventism. Its significance lies not in an immediate dramatic outcome, but in the lasting impact it had on the denomination's language, ministerial training, and historical consciousness. When analyzed with documentary attention and temporal distance, the episode reveals the natural dynamic of debate, adjustment, and continuity that accompanies expanding religious movements.